This is a homily for the third Sunday of Lent. The first reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verses 3 to 7. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 4, verses 5 to 42. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Let's review our Lenten journey so far. On the first Sunday of Lent, we joined Jesus in the desert. God's Spirit led Jesus into the desert, and there he was tested. On the second Sunday of Lent, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain. There, in their presence, he was transfigured. The Gospel readings for the first and second Sundays of Lent this year were taken from the Gospel of St. Matthew. On this third Sunday of Lent, we journey with Jesus to a Samaritan town called Sychar, and rest with him by a well, a story found only in John's Gospel. In chapter 2 of John's Gospel, we're told that Jesus was in Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. Jesus and his disciples then went into the Judean countryside. He then left Judea and set off back to Galilee. Passing through Samaria, he came to the Samaritan town called Sychar. John is quite deliberate in how he frames this moment. He writes that Jesus had to pass through Samaria, using the Greek verb dei, which means it is necessary or it must happen. This is not the language of convenience or geography. In other words, he's not telling us that Jesus travelled through Samaria because it was the shortest route to Galilee. It was the shortest route, but Jews usually went out of their way to avoid travelling through Samaria. John is telling us that Jesus goes there because he must, not because it is convenient. The verb dei in John regularly signals divine necessity, what must happen because it belongs to God's saving plan. The meeting at the well is not accidental. It is part of the Father's purpose, the moment when barriers of ethnicity, gender, and religious hostility are deliberately crossed. In John's Gospel, whenever Jesus must do something, it is because God's work is pressing forward. And here, that work draws Jesus into Samaritan territory to reveal that the gift of living water is not confined to Jerusalem or to one people, but offered to all. Tired by the journey, Jesus rests by Jacob's well, while the disciples go into the town to buy some food. It's about noon, and a Samaritan woman comes to the well to draw water. So who are the Samaritans, and why was there tension between Jews and Samaritans? To answer that question, we need to go back to the 8th century BC. The superpower of the day was Assyria, and the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. Following the death of King Solomon in 931 BC, what had been a united monarchy divided into two separate kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. This story is told in the first book of Kings, chapters 12 to 14. The capital of Israel was Samaria, and the capital of Judah was Jerusalem. According to the biblical writers, the union between north and south had been fragile at best, and the fault line that divided the two opened up again following Solomon's death. In the 8th century BC, The Assyrians were wiping out the smaller states of the ancient Near East. The northern kingdom of Israel, like many other states in the region, was absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, and the independence of the southern kingdom of Judah was severely curtailed. To cut a long story short, the northern kingdom of Israel rebelled, and the Assyrian reprisal was swift. The Assyrians crushed Israelite resistance, and Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was reduced to ruins. The southern kingdom of Judah was spared for the time being because it chose survival over rebellion, submitting to Assyria, paying tribute, and accepting limited independence in order to protect Jerusalem, the royal house of David, and the temple. It was Assyrian practice to exile significant numbers of the population of the territories they had conquered to other parts of their empire. The royal annals of Sargon II of Assyria, who reigned from 722 to 705 BC, say that, "I besieged and conquered Samaria. I led away as prisoners 27,290 inhabitants." The Assyrians then repopulated conquered territories with outsiders. The second book of Kings tells the story of how they colonized Israel by settling it with people from a number of Mesopotamian towns. These people eventually assimilated and intermarried with the Israelite population who remained in the land, even adopting the religion of Israel. The area became a province of Assyria under the name of Samaria and was governed by an Assyrian ruler. However, most Jews regarded the Samaritans as a mixed race of semi-pagans. They believed that the Samaritans were descended partly from foreign settlers brought in by the Assyrians and partly from Israelites who remained in the land, and that their religion was therefore corrupted. A judgment shaped by centuries of religious hostility rather than by a balanced or fair assessment. Jews and Samaritans were not simply neighbours who didn't get along. They were rival religious communities who claimed to worship the same God but disagreed about where God had chosen to be worshipped. The argument went back centuries. By the Persian period, about 500 to 300 BC, the Samaritans had developed their own religious identity. They accepted the law of Moses, but rejected Jerusalem. Instead, they insisted that Mount Gerizim was the place God had chosen for his temple. Jews, on the other hand, believed just as firmly that Jerusalem was the one and only dwelling place of God. This disagreement became explosive in 128 BC, when the Jewish ruler John Hyrcanus destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. From that point on, relations collapsed. Each side regarded the other as wrong, illegitimate, and unfaithful to God. The hostility was not just theological. It affected everyday life. There were outbreaks of violence, especially when Galilean Jews passed through Samaria on pilgrimage. Because of this, many Jews travelling between Judea and Galilee avoided Samaria altogether, choosing a longer but safer route east of the Jordan River. In simple terms, Jews and Samaritans believed in the same God, read the same law, but could not agree on where God lived, and that disagreement poisoned everything. Today's gospel is set in Samaria, at a well just outside the town of Sychar. Most scholars hold that Sychar refers either to the city of Shechem itself or to a village immediately adjacent to it. Here you can see photographs of Jacob's well today. The biblical scholar Raymond Brown believes that the present site of the well can be accepted with confidence. There has been a church on this site since at least the 4th century AD. The book of Genesis tells us that the dying Jacob bequeathed the city of Shechem and its surroundings to Joseph. But Genesis does not mention a well. The association of this well with Jacob therefore reflects a long-standing local tradition, preserved because wells were central to daily life and remembered across generations. Whether or not Jacob himself ever drank from this well, the tradition mattered. It connected this place to Israel's ancestral story, a story shared in different ways by both Jews and Samaritans. I'm sure that John wants his readers to pay attention to the setting of today's gospel. Jesus meets a woman at a well. For anyone steeped in Israel's scriptures, that is not a neutral detail. In the book of Genesis, wells are places of encounter, promise, and betrothal. In Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 to 27, Abraham's servant meets Rebekah at a well. She draws water, shows generosity, and the meeting leads to her becoming the bride of Isaac. In Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 to 14, Jacob meets Rachel at a well, rolls away the stone from the top of the well, waters her flock, and the encounter marks the beginning of their union. In both cases, a well is the setting where a future bride is encountered, and a new chapter in the family of Israel begins. John expects his readers to hear these echoes. When Jesus sits at Jacob's well and begins a conversation with a woman, the scene is already charged with meaning. This is the kind of place where bridegrooms meet brides. That motif has already been introduced at the very beginning of John's Gospel. At the wedding feast of Cana in John chapter 2, Jesus provides an abundance of wine when the original supply runs out. In the ancient world, providing wine was the responsibility of the bridegroom. Yet John never identifies the bridegroom at Cana by name. Instead, Jesus quietly steps into that role, supplying not just enough wine, but wine of extraordinary quality and abundance. It is the first of his signs revealing his glory. In chapter 3, John the Baptist will speak of Jesus explicitly as the bridegroom. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. By the time we reach the well in Samaria, the reader has already been prepared to see Jesus in these terms. So, when Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, John is not telling a random travel story. He is deliberately placing Jesus within Israel's betrothal imagery. But there is a striking difference. This woman is not a young virgin like Rebekah or Rachel. She is a Samaritan whose personal life has been unstable and fragmented, leaving her without the security that marriage and family normally provided. She comes to the well at noon, not during the cooler hours when women usually drew water together. This strongly suggests that she lives at a distance from the other women of the village, whether through exclusion or because her situation has led her to avoid them. And yet it is precisely here, in this unlikely place, that Jesus chooses to reveal himself most openly. Before Jesus speaks of water that gives eternal life, John wants us to recognize who is speaking. The bridegroom of Israel has come to a well once more, not to claim a single bride, but to begin gathering a people drawn from beyond the boundaries of Judea, Jerusalem, and even Israel itself. If we want to understand what the evangelist is teaching us through this encounter, it may be helpful to go back to two questions that bookend John's Gospel. The first question comes in chapter 1, verse 38, when Jesus turns to the first disciples and asks, "What are you looking for?" The second comes near the end of the Gospel, in chapter 20, verse 15, when the risen Jesus asks Mary Magdalene, "Who are you looking for?" Between those two questions, John unfolds a series of encounters that explore what it truly means to seek and what it means to be found. Today we listen to one of those encounters as Jesus meets a woman at a well and gently exposes what she is really searching for, even before she knows how to name it. Before we consider the encounter between Jesus and the woman at the well, let's pause briefly with that question. Who and what am I looking for? We all look for different things in life, and not all of them are unimportant. The psychologist Abraham Maslow spoke about a hierarchy of needs, starting with basic necessities like food and shelter, and continuing with safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. As Christians, we might recognize much of ourselves in that description, while also acknowledging that ultimately none of these things finally answers the deepest hunger of the human heart. The writer David Brooks makes a similar point in a different way. He speaks of two mountains in life. The first mountain is about success, approval, and personal happiness. Goals our culture constantly encourages us to pursue. But many people reach the summit of that first mountain only to discover that it does not satisfy. Is this all there is? They ask. They sense that a deeper journey is still calling. Thomas Merton once captured this truth memorably when he wrote that people can spend their whole lives climbing the ladder of success, only to discover at the top that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. It is precisely into our confusion about what we are really seeking that today's Gospel speaks. Jesus is travelling from Jerusalem back to Galilee, and he comes to a well in Samaria. A woman arrives who thinks she knows exactly what she is looking for. She has come for water. John invites us to see, however, that something far deeper is about to be uncovered. Jesus speaks to her, "Give me a drink." In making this request, Jesus deliberately crosses two social boundaries that are not immediately obvious to us in the 21st century. Firstly, a Jewish man, especially a teacher, did not initiate conversation with an unknown woman in public. Secondly, Jews avoided social contact with Samaritans altogether. Jesus' request violates both conventions at once. That is why the woman is so taken aback. "What? You are a Jew, and you ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Her reaction tells us just how unexpected this encounter is. Jesus replies, if you only knew what God is offering and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have been the one to ask, and he would have given you living water." The phrase living water has a double meaning. It can refer to fresh, flowing water, spring water rather than water drawn from a cistern, but it can also mean life-giving water. John intentionally chooses a word that works on both levels, and this is typical of the irony he uses throughout his gospel. We as readers already know who Jesus is and what he is offering. The woman does not. She hears only running water, and so asks the obvious question, how can you get running water from such a deep well without a bucket? And because this is Jacob's well, she presses the question further. Are you a greater man than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself with his sons and his cattle? Once again, the question is charged with irony. We know the answer. She does not. Jesus replies, "Whoever drinks this water will get thirsty again, but anyone who drinks the water that I shall give will never be thirsty again." There is much that could be said about this exchange, but one point stands out clearly. Jesus is the true source of life-giving water. He is indeed far greater than Jacob. But there is another moment of revelation in this gospel, one that is not immediately obvious in English translations. The woman says to Jesus, "I know that Messiah, the one called Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will declare everything." Jesus replies, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." The Greek text reads, "Ego eimi halalon soi." Literally, I am the one speaking to you. John deliberately frames Jesus' reply in a way that recalls the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When God reveals his name to Moses in Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, he says, "Ehia asher ehia," I am who I am. In the Greek translation of Exodus, I am is rendered ego eimi. In John's Gospel, this language consistently points beyond simple self-identification. Used here without a predicate, it invites the reader to recognize that the one speaking at the well is none other than the eternal Word, the one of whom the prologue says, "The Word was with God, and the Word was God." The next point that John makes is also important. The woman does not remain at the well. She leaves her water jar behind, the very reason she came, and goes back into the town. The detail is quietly symbolic. What once defined her need is no longer what drives her. She speaks to the people of the town about Jesus. She does not offer a polished confession of faith, nor does she claim full understanding. She simply bears witness to what has happened to her. "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. Could he be the Messiah?" Her testimony is tentative, even questioning, and yet it is enough. John then tells us that many Samaritans come to Jesus and begin to believe, first because of the woman's word, and then because they hear Jesus for themselves. In this gospel, those once dismissed as religious outsiders become among the first to recognize who Jesus truly is. The woman who arrived at the well alone becomes the one through whom a whole community is drawn to Christ. This is deeply characteristic of John's Gospel. Revelation does not terminate in private insight. It moves outward into witness. Those who encounter Jesus are not simply given something for themselves. They are drawn into God's work of making him known. The Samaritan woman is not merely a recipient of grace. She becomes a bearer of testimony, not despite the fractured course of her life, but through it. In the words of Martin Buber, all revelation is a summons and a sending. I mentioned last Sunday that Matthew's Gospel presents Jesus as a new and greater Moses, and the Gospel story as a new and greater Exodus. John's Gospel does something very similar. It too tells the story of Jesus against the backdrop of the Exodus, the foundational story of Israel's faith. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks calls the Exodus the framing event of Jewish history. He writes that on the festival of Passover, Jews do not merely tell the story of the Exodus, they relive it. They eat unleavened bread and bitter herbs to remember oppression, and they drink wine and sing songs to celebrate the fact that they are here to tell the tale. Taking our cue from that insight, let us turn briefly to today's first reading from the book of Exodus. Soon after leaving Egypt, the people are tormented by thirst. They complain bitterly to Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Was it so that I should die of thirst, my children too, and my cattle?" Moses appeals to God, and God tells him to strike the rock. When he does so, water flows abundantly. Life is sustained. The people do not perish. That place is named Massah and Meribah, names that in English mean testing and quarrelling, because there the people put God to the test. It is a moment of profound failure of trust, and yet, even there, God responds not with punishment, but with water. The rock becomes a source of life. Psalm 95, today's responsorial psalm, draws us further into that story. Come, ring out our joy to the Lord. Hail the rock who saves us. God is the rock from whom life-giving water flows. John's Gospel returns to this theme later in chapter 7, when Jesus goes up to Jerusalem for the festival of tabernacles, or Sukkot in Hebrew. This feast originally celebrated the harvest, but over time it became closely associated with the Exodus, with God's care for Israel during its journey through the wilderness. During this festival, the people lived in temporary shelters, recalling the fragility of life on the way to freedom. Central to the celebration was a daily water ritual. For 7 days, priests processed from the pool of Siloam to the temple, pouring water on the altar in prayer for rain and blessing. It was a dramatic reminder that life depends entirely on God's gift. It is into that setting that Jesus speaks. On the final day of the feast, he cries out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink." John tells us that Jesus is not simply commenting on the festival, he is claiming its meaning for himself. The words Jesus uses echo the prophet Ezekiel's vision of water flowing from the temple and bringing life to the whole world. And John's Gospel will return to that image one final time at the cross. When Jesus is pierced, blood and water flow from his side, a stark, silent fulfilment of everything that has been promised. The true temple has been revealed. The source of life now flows from him. New Testament scholar Richard Hayes observes that it is impossible to understand John's Jesus apart from Israel's scriptures, festivals, and symbols. John is not inventing new meaning. He is showing us where the old meaning finally leads. Which brings us back to the well in Samaria. Jesus tells the woman, "Whoever drinks this water will be thirsty again, but anyone who drinks the water that I shall give will never be thirsty again." What are you looking for? Moses struck the rock and water flowed, quenching a physical thirst. But in this new and greater Exodus, Jesus comes to meet a deeper thirst, the thirst for meaning, for life, for God. And he promises that whoever drinks the water he gives will never be thirsty again. In the end, the gospel asks not whether we are thirsty, but whether we will dare to drink from the one place where life is truly given.